Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel. My name is Kyle Ferrier. I'm from the Korea Economic Institute of America, the organizer of today's panel. Today's panel is part of 3 that we're doing here at ISA, the papers from which will be included in our joint U.S.-Korea academic studies publication, which is, of course, wouldn't be able to be done without the help of Professor Gil Rosman. So thank you, Gil, for all the work that you've done to help organize the panel and the edits and the comments that you've provided so far for the papers that have been produced for the panel. We're here to talk about the Trump economic impact in East Asia for the past 2 years. It's clearly been a lot going on in the news, and the panelists today will try and give us some perspective on regional views, what's been going on in terms of how the America First economic policy has impacted their respective countries, as well as someone, not necessarily America First, but a different form of pressure from the White House as we move forward. So I'll just introduce everyone in the manner in which they'll start talking, and then I'll turn things over to them. So up first, we'll have Peter Harrell for the Center for New American Security, followed by Shihoko Goto from the Wilson Center. Then we'll have Karen Pitakdumrongkit from Nanyang Technical University, and Ben from the University of Pennsylvania. You'll notice that we're actually one person short. Jun Yoon from the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy was supposed to be here to present on the Korea perspective, but he not only had a good excuse, he had 2 good excuses. His wife just had twins. Wow. Yeah, so I'll be giving everyone a brief overview of his paper. I won't take us for the just to give you an idea of sort of what his perspective is. And again, this will all be available later in our book, and I would encourage you to follow up when it's released sometime this summer. So I'll turn things over now to Peter to get us started on the China perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here, and thank you, Professor Rosman, for organizing the panel. I thought I would open the panel by giving a few minutes of framing remarks about how I see the U.S.-China economic relations, and then some of the third country impacts that I see. I'm probably actually going to look at it a little bit more from a Washington perspective than a regional perspective, mostly because I'm from the Washington perspective as a former policymaker now at a DC-based think tank, and don't want to pretend to know the regional perspective and opine kind of out of my area. So where am I from sort of a U.S. perspective? Where do I think we are 2 years in to a Trump administration international economic strategy that looks fundamentally different from anything we've seen in 30 years. I think the closest recent analogy to what we've seen the Trump administration do with respect to its international economic strategy in some ways is some of the steps the Reagan administration took back in the 1980s with respect to tariffs, using many of the same legal and regulatory tools that the Trump administration is taking today. Some of the similarity may be coincidence. Some of it may be that the person largely responsible for the Trump administration's strategy, the U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer, served in the Reagan administration, doing many of the same things back then. So, of course, has extensive personal history. I think that with respect to where we are in terms of how the Trump administration is approaching economic issues with China, we are really seeing, putting aside Trump's own sort of long-standing personal views on trade and economics, we are seeing 2 related but also distinct trends in the United States coming to a head. The first one is kind of the culmination of many years of growing U.S. business sector frustration with a whole range of perceived unfair Chinese economic practices. I was in the State Department in the previous administration. There was certainly a growing displeasure with, whether it was Chinese IP theft or state-owned enterprise subsidies or all lack of market access. they kind of rose across the prior administration, but really towards the end of the prior administration and then the beginning of this administration really kind of came to a head of deep and profound frustration. And I think most interesting and often underappreciated out of Washington, there was a marked shift maybe in about 2015 where major U.S. business interests that for many years had advocated for kind of a business-friendly, sort of even keel economic approach to China began to drop their opposition to a more aggressive and hawkish approach towards China. And so the sort of constituency in the U.S. that had long sort of advocated for a trade-friendly, economically friendly sort of relationship began to back off on that. The second major related trend, but also distinct, is the sort of rise of China, or perception in Washington that China is now a strategic competitor and not simply an economic competitor. So you see, a great deal of concern starting kind of about 8 or 9 years ago and really rising over the last 3 or 4 years about what China is doing in the South China Sea, about the modernization of the Chinese military, about China using the Belt and Road Initiative to develop economic and diplomatic relationships outside of East Asia, including in what this administration sees as our own backyard of Latin America. And so you had sort of one strain being this economic competition, and then the strategic competition coming together, and really leading to a bipartisan moment. Well, this is sort of the shifts we've seen are being driven by the Trump administration. I think we're in a bipartisan moment of reconsideration towards China. The example I cite frequently on this is an article in Foreign Affairs from about a year ago by a colleague of mine at CNES, Eli Ratner, along with Kaewkamol, who'd been longtime advocates for an engagement-oriented approach to China, coming out in Foreign Affairs and talking about the failure of kind of America's grand strategy going back to the 1990s on China. And so I think while there's a lot to be there are major differences between the parties, between different experts within the Trump administration on exactly how to approach China going forward. I think there is consensus that a much more hawkish trade approach is needed. What we've seen over the last 2 years is a qualitative ratcheting up of pressure. Obviously, the tariffs, which President Trump began implementing beginning early last year, March of last year, under Section 301, which is a trade remedy tool that has existed since the 1970s, have attracted most of the attention. So today, there are 25% tariffs on $50 billion of pre-tariff imports of U.S. goods, and 10% tariffs on another $200 billion of U.S. imports of Chinese goods. The first tranche being largely kind of higher-end industrial products, a $50 billion tranche. The second being more generic consumer type goods, to oversimplify. Well, the tariffs have gotten most of the attention. I think in many ways, the action that has been kind of happening piecemeal and increasingly systematically using other economic tools to put pressure on China are at least as interesting. So we have the tariffs in place and the trade negotiations, which I'll come back to, going on. But we are also seeing this growing set of lines of action using other tools to target specific areas of perceived both economic and strategic challenge from China. So to give a couple of these, last year Congress enacted 2 important new statutes. One, the Export Control Reform Act of 2018. One, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA. These 2 acts are going, over the next year or so as they get fully implemented, to fundamentally change the U.S. approach to both export controls and to the review of foreign investment, particularly Chinese investment in the United States, but will also have impact on other East Asian, Middle Eastern, Latin American investment in the U.S. So export controls, from a U.S. perspective, have historically focused on high-end military items and items of dual use, kind of military and civilian application, to make sure they don't fall into the military hands of adversaries. Under the Export Control Reform Act, we're seeing a qualitative broadening of export controls that with respect to countries like China that are strategic competitors of the United States will limit technologies with a vast range of applications and not just kind of military and dual use technologies. So the Commerce Department is currently looking at how to control AI, artificial intelligence cooperation with China, advanced robotics, biotechnology, a whole range of new technologies of very broad application. Now, I don't think the Commerce Department in the end is going to shut off all exports of these technologies to China, but you're going to see, I think, a much more complicated regime that will be much broader and more economically and not just militarily focused than you saw before. We've seen the U.S., in addition to sort of the investment reviews and export controls, we've seen the U.S. Step up law enforcement tools against China. So we've seen the Department of Justice vastly increase its efforts to investigate and prosecute Chinese-specific economic espionage and other kind of perceived unfair Chinese activities. We've also seen the U.S. take targeted actions against individual but important Chinese companies. Huawei, obviously being in the news, indicted currently both for Iran sanctions violations and for intellectual property theft. Commerce Department last year restricted temporarily U.S. exports to ZTE, extracted a $1 billion fine and huge U.S. oversight of ZTE in exchange for dropping that control. Also last year, the Commerce Department restricted exports of U.S. products to another Chinese semiconductor firm, Fujian Jinhua Semiconductor. And so I think we've seen this sort of qualitative increase in pressure, not just in the tariffs, but also in the use of targeted tools. How has China responded to this? Well, I think at a strategic level, we've seen China respond reciprocally, but in ways that avoid escalation. So China responded with reciprocal tariffs, but not escalatory tariffs. China has also, by and large, avoided provocative acts that could trigger further escalation from the United States. So, for example, after the U.S. Indicted Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, and she was detained in Canada pursuant to a U.S. request, we saw China retaliate by arresting Canadian citizens in China, but not American citizens. I think China, because of its own current economic vulnerabilities and seeing the potential impacts on export volumes as a result of the tariffs, and in the interest of reaching a trade deal with President Trump, who is ultimately a transactional negotiating-oriented individual, has by and large at a strategic level sought to downplay tensions. They don't want to be taken for a patsy. They've responded where they feel they have to, but they've sought to downplay tensions in the hope of getting an overall trade deal. As I've mentioned, and as all of you know, seems likely, trade negotiations are ongoing. Seems likely we're going to get some kind of trade deal in the coming months between Beijing and Washington. I think that, based on the press reports, my own conversations with the administration, you're probably going to see a deal where at some point most, if not all, probably not all, most of the tariffs from the U.S. side will come off. And in return, you're going to get some moderate concessions on market access and increased Chinese purchases of U.S. goods, which I think will be seen as a solid but not overwhelming benefit to the United States. I think it is important to keep in mind that all of these targeted tools that I went through are going to continue to play out over the next couple of years, even if there's a U.S.-China trade deal. And so I think you're going to continue to see a pretty complex regime around investment, around export controls, around targeted actions against individual Chinese companies over the next couple of years, despite, at a macro level, a trade deal. I sort of have begun to talk of this in Washington, and just in closing, there's been this debate over the last couple of years, and this phrase that's come up more and more frequently about decoupling or divorce between the U.S. and Chinese economies. I think that's not going to happen. Certainly if we get a trade deal at a top-line level, that's not going to happen. If anything, U.S. exports and investment in China will increase. The way I think of it is I think we're entering an era of strategic coupling, where there's going to be a much more kind of nuanced and sector-by-sector approach to economic cooperation, where there'll be, 70, 80% to oversimplify economic sectors. There will be a fairly free flow of goods, services, IP, people, and the rest. But you're going to see more and more strategic sectors that will be, if you will, strategically decoupled. And that will have important implications for third countries as well as the U.S.-China relationship. I will leave it there.
All right, great. Thank you, Peter. We'll turn over to Shihoko now. We'll talk about the impact on Japan.
Right. Well, I too would like to thank KEI. Kyle, you've been great, and thank you, Gil, for inviting me to be part of this really august group in the first place. So I've been tasked with focusing on Japan, and it's what the Trump administration's economic realities have had in assessing Japan's own relations, not just with the United States, but its own economic struggles. Looking first at what the Trump administration has meant for Japan from an economic perspective. Firstly, the United States has really pushed other countries, including Japan, to refocus on rules of engagement in the region on an economic perspective. And it's also forced Japan and other countries to redefine economic relations with China as well as a result. And whilst these are not bad things, what the Trump administration has forced countries like Japan to do is to really reassess what it is that they want from the United States and how they can actually move forward with their own interests regarding China as well. What the Trump administration's challenge has been is that whilst most countries have agreed that taking a more hardline approach against China from an economic view is not a bad thing in itself, perhaps the messaging could be a little bit more finessed by the Trump administration, but certainly what its objectives are not bad. But how it has been treating its allies as it tries to move forward with this America First type of economic nationalism has been very damaging, not just with key U.S. partners, including Japan, but also in the European Union and beyond. But in light of that, in spite of all these uncertainties, Japan, I think, if we were to give a scorecard, has weathered quite well. It has actually been a source of stability in the region, politically as well as economic leadership. And it has come out doing two things. It has really come out as a champion of free trade. And it certainly has been able to keep the TPP together in spite of the United States leaving that mega trade agreement. In fact, CPTPP is now has progressed so far that it is not only in effect at this stage, but it is also in the process of expanding into new members. And South Korea, amongst other countries, have already expressed official interest in joining the CPTPP. And Japan's ambition in this is also to have the United States re-enter, if not under this administration, then certainly under a new leadership in the future. And it also wants to keep the door open for China to enter the agreement down the line as well. The challenge for Japan, though, it has an uncertain future with the United States. To have doubts about the United States being a reliable economic partner, and then secondly, to have to balance its economic interests with China on the one hand, and its strategic rivalry with China on the other. One of the frustrations that the Prime Minister Abe's government has had over the last 2 years is that his own personal relationships with Donald Trump have not translated into improved trade relations. Not only has Tokyo failed to keep the United States in the TPP, even though it had pressured Washington greatly to remain in the institution, it has also been unable to stop the United States pushing for bilateral trade deals with the Japanese. Japan has also already been hit by Section 232 of the steel and aluminum tariffs. And the rhetoric coming from the United States, we've already heard about, Lighthizer being the negotiator back in the 80s. There's a lot of rhetoric harking back to the 1980s that is being echoed by the administration today. In spite of the fact that the reality, especially on the FDI front, is quite different from how it was 30 years ago. Japan has made a conscious effort to invest increasingly in the United States, and it is actually the third largest FDI provider to America after the UK and Canada. And the car sector alone actually employs 92,000 Americans directly, with over at least 24 plants across the United States. That said, the reality actually, if you look, for instance, in the car sector, is that it hasn't actually changed all that much. The cars are still a hot button issue because it is the source of great deficit with the United States, and that demand for Japanese cars appears to still be strong as well. The result of this uncertainty and concern about Washington's approach to Japan vis-a-vis trade is that, firstly, and above all else, Japan's trust in the United States has abated. And so if you look at a poll from NHK, the national broadcaster, 80% of those polled say they are concerned about bilateral relations in the future. And Pew Research finds that more countries see the United States as a bigger threat than China. And so what does this mean for countries like Japan? It means that there is a détente with China. There is a revisionist, there is a shifting view when it comes to dealing with Beijing. And so in Tokyo, what has happened is that in October of last year, Abe met with Xi Jinping in Beijing. This was the first summit meeting between China and Japan in 7 years. It was declared to be a shift from competition to cooperation, and it came up with a number of statements. One of the most tangible developments is that the two sides, Japan and China, have agreed to expand in investment projects in third countries, in particular in developing infrastructure in Southeast Asia, and most notably in Thailand, which really is a big win for Bangkok. But then the question becomes, how does this square with Tokyo on the one hand promoting with the United States the Indo-Pacific strategy on the one hand, and enhancing projects in development assistance in Southeast Asia on the other with China? So we've already talked a little bit about decoupling, but what Japan's objective here is to decouple its relations with China, becoming a stronger economic partner with China on the one hand, whilst if you talk to any security official in Japan, they will say that the biggest security threat to Japan is not North Korea, is not Russia, it remains China. But the Trump administration's approach has really forced Japan and other countries to hedge against the uncertainties of the United States. And now, we've already heard too that there is a growing bipartisan support for taking a hardline stance against China. And I would actually argue that it is perhaps becoming more dangerous for the United States to express a more conciliatory approach to China, precisely because there is this bipartisanship in dealing with China. The United States is taking a two-pronged approach when it comes to trade vis-a-vis China. It is fighting a trade war on two fronts. The first front is really on the deficit of goods, and it is doing so through a number of tools, but mostly through imposing various tariffs and punitive measures to make Chinese imports more expensive into the United States. And this approach has had critics within the United States, but certainly outside of the United States, and especially in Japan, it has come under great criticism, because if it's China, who's going to be next? and as Japan is trying to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement with China, with the United States, this approach really puts Tokyo at great risk. But the second approach that the United States is taking with China has been much more successful in uniting like-minded countries. That is to say, Washington is taking on China and pushing for structural reform and calling for greater IP protection, reforming state-owned enterprises, ending state forced technology transfer, etc. Japan and the United States, together with the European Union, has already begun to do this within the WTO framework and really within the bigger umbrella of WTO reform. And we expect that momentum to continue. And it is certainly another approach, one of the few approaches that the Trump administration has had in taking a more multilateral approach in dealing with the China threat. I do also want to bring the EU into this because the EU has had some similarities in dealing with the challenge of balancing stronger economic relations with China on the one hand and hedging against uncertainties regarding the United States on the other. And so over the weekend, we saw, for instance, French President Macron and Angela Merkel and the EU's Juncker coming together in Paris and meeting with Xi Jinping. And we see that the tone has changed greatly in Europe, moving away from discussions of a strategic partnership to a systemic rivalry, moving away from talking about looking to China's development assistance strategy, but really more looking at China as an economic competitor, especially when it comes to technological leadership. China's approach to this has been to divide the European Union and to point at its weaknesses and trying to deal with countries on a bilateral basis. So it would look to some of the specific interests of the European countries. That kind of divide and conquer approach has been seen by China in Asia as well. And the divide and conquer approach has been something that Japan has had to manage as well. A divide between Japan and South Korea, for instance, has been to the advantage of China. And the Chinese really are trying very hard to push Japan, its weaknesses, in trying to garner more support for Chinese investments as a result. So when we look ahead, we can, of course, focus on what the impact of the U.S.-China trade war will be on the broader economic landscape of the region and how that will impact Japan. And that is certainly a big conversation that is going forward in Tokyo today. And there is great concern in Tokyo about what the bilateral trade negotiations will mean, and in particular, how that will hurt the Japanese auto sector, because that makes up the bulk of the trade deficit with the United States. But if we are to look at this from a bigger grand strategy perspective, the focus really should be much more on the interests not of today, of Japan now, but Japan of the future. And the Japan of the future will be increasingly concerned about technological espionage. It will be more concerned about industrial competition with China. It will be concerned about how to balance innovation partnerships with China on the one hand, and to compete with China in developing new rules for innovation on the other. Japan's economic challenge moving forward also will be to address some of the very large internal problems that it has, not least the demographic challenge of Japan and the potential of AI and robotics to deal with this, and how Japan can cooperate not just with the United States but other countries in across the globe. So, thanks.
Now I'll turn things over to Karen.
Here, you can have this back.
I was tasked to look at how the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is going to affect the U.S. ASEAN economic relation and governance. So what I'm trying to do is first I'm going to talk about what are the economic aspects of the U.S. of the Trump administration Indo-Pacific strategy. The second one is I look at how this strategy interacts with the agendas or the programs that are pushed forward by ASEAN countries. And the third one, I'll provide some policy recommendation going forward. What would be ways to foster or further enhance U.S.-ASEAN economic governance? Okay. So before I jump before I dissect the economic angle of the Trump administration Indo-Pacific strategy, let me discuss a little bit about what motivates the Trump administration to form the strategy in the first place. I think most of you probably know that the Indo-Pacific as a concept is not new. As you know, Pacific Command, or now it's called Indo-Pacific Command, has been operated across two oceans, India and Pacific. And also, Obama administration recognized India as a major pillar of the U.S. Asia policy, and also elevated the U.S.-India strategic into U.S.-India strategic and commercial dialogue in 2015. But what this thing? So the question is, what distinguished Trump administration Indo-Pacific strategy from the previous administration concept of Indo-Pacific? Is that because this Trump Indo-Pacific strategy is crafted using the assumption that the U.S.-China are locked in strategic competition, right? And the competition is displayed in the Indo-Pacific region. Okay? So that's the primary motivation of the Trump administration for formulating the policy. And the second motivation is that the Indo-Pacific strategy is a region where the U.S. economic will lie in the future. So that's also another one. The third one is that if you observe the region, there's choke points, especially the Malacca Strait, which if there's instability in that area, the U.S. principle such as freedom of navigation would be undermined. So this also the motivation. Okay, so yes, so just to give you some idea of why this, if you look through the national document, right, for example, the national security document, you'll see that there's a mentioning about how U.S.-China are locked in strategic competition. And China is crafted as a revisionist state, right? So China seeks to display the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific strategy to expand the reaches of its state-driven economic model and reorder the region in its favor. Right? So another mentioning what is that the China is using economic inducement and penalties, influence operations, and implying military threats to persuade other states to keep its political and security agenda. China's infrastructure investment and trade strategy reinforce its geopolitical aspirations. So you can see clearly that there's some competition elements going on. So what are actually the economic aspects of the Trump administration Indo-Pacific strategy? So okay, before I jump in that, let me explain a little bit that the strategy hinges on two modifiers: free and open. Free. The concept of free has international and domestic dimensions. So international dimension is about free freedom from coercion by other states, right? So this will also talk about about the principle of sovereignty, the rules-based order, dispute settlement. Free in a domestic aspect talks about freer people, right? So this one also touches on the notion of fundamental rights, democratic values, good governance. But for the concept of open, so it covers four kind of open. So open commons mean that open sea lanes, airways, cyberspace. Open logistics mean about connectivity that drive regional growth and integration. Open investment, it talks about investment, open investment environment, and also market mechanism driven driving investment. Open trade you're more familiar with, we just talk about free, fair, and reciprocal trade. Okay. So if you look at the, I think at the remarks by the staff at the State Department, you know that the termination has three areas of economic engagement that they would like to engage the Indo-Pacific nations, right? Trade, investment, infrastructure, and connectivity. Okay. Regarding trade, so the key thing that the termination would like to pursue is to promote free, fair, and reciprocal trade. And by getting there, they think that achieving it would be, they'll be fostering trade arrangement, which to further liberate trade, lowering barriers and reinforce rule of free trade. And also, they would like to negotiate a better international deals, primarily the bilateral one, and also reforming the multilateral trading system, like the WTO. As for investment, so the key thing the administration would like to achieve is to foster good rules, good governance, better investment climate, and so facilitate private sector investment, getting private sector to be more involved in the regional investment, right? And also the investment that encourage entrepreneurship and innovation. So it's about fostering good rules to facilitate investment, getting more private sector involvement. Regarding infrastructure and connectivity, so the U.S. administration is trying to promote best value, cost-effective, and high-quality infrastructure project and sustainable development. It will be supporting the multilateral financial institution, the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, and also trying to reform the American Development Finance, and the Build Act has passed and was signed to law. So now the U.S. government is creating the IDFC, and which will combine the U.S. development finance activity under one umbrella. Okay, so I think you probably know that this is obviously a U.S. response to the China Belt and Road Initiative, right? So, and which the Vice President Pence made clear, and in APEC last year about that the U.S. approach is the better option. We don't drown partners in the sea of debt. We don't coerce and compromise your independence. The U.S. deals only fairly. We do not offer a constricting belt or a one-way road. Right? So without mentioning China, we all know that he's referred to China. So these are the details of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So the next thing I'd like to do is how would this strategy interact with the agenda pushed forward by ASEAN states? Looking at in the area of trade, okay, we can see an obvious clash between what U.S. trying to do and what ASEAN would like to pursue. So U.S. Even though they say they would like to strike improve the existing trade deals with regional states, but they would like to do it bilaterally. which obviously clashes with what ASEAN would like to do. Because ASEAN members would like to foster a multilateral trade deals rather than bilateral one. So the question becomes, okay, why ASEAN would like to do a multilateral trade deals rather than bilateral one? So the first, there's multiple reasons. So one of the reasons are about the nature of the ASEAN economy, which intertwine in what we call transnational production network of the global value chain. So if you look at the number, 85% of ASEAN total export are in intermediate goods. And if you look at intra-ASEAN trade, 55 to 60% of intra-ASEAN trade are trade in intermediate goods, right? So you can see that ASEAN economy are well embedded in the transnational production work. And also, there was also a second reason is that there's a rising middle class in ASEAN right now, which could provide newer market opportunities for businesses. For example, right now we have about 24% of ASEAN population as a middle class, but in 2013, the middle class will constitute 51% of the whole ASEAN population. So that's a big market, a new market to capture. Yeah. Okay, so that's also, yes. So these are among the reasons why ASEAN want to pursue a multilateral trade agreement. And as you can see, ASEAN have its own economic integration project like ASEAN Economic Community, and also we are trying to foster trade deals, multiple trade deal with six ASEAN dialogue partner, and some ASEAN countries are also involved in a multilateral trade deal called CTBT. We have 3 minutes. Okay, I'll move on. Okay. For investment is likely to complement, even though Trump administration has not been planned out concrete program to foster investment in ASEAN region yet. But there's a sign that his policy direction could complement what ASEAN is trying to do. But there's some concern about even though the directions seem to complement each other, but ASEAN countries are concerned about the stricter rule put forward by CFIUS. I think you probably know that CFIUS was empowered by the FIRMA Act. It can investigate now more categories of investment, of acquisition, or foreign acquisition of the U.S. firm. And also there's also an open question regarding CFIUS about whether CFIUS would investigate minority stake investment, right, in the U.S. And would CFIUS in the future be able to be granted power to investigate the U.S. outbound FDI to ASEAN? So that's one of their concerns about the risk. So if CFIUS is empowered, there's a concern about this entity would alter the U.S. ASEAN investment tie and governance going forward. Okay. Going to infrastructure. There's a clear sign of complementarity between what U.S. trying to offer and what ASEAN want. So as you can see, we have an ASEAN infrastructure gap. ASEAN will need 198 billion annually from 2016 to 2013. But our only funding mechanism called ASEAN Investment Fund can supply up to 485 million. So a huge infrastructure gap that the U.S. transmission station can fill in. And also, it would be an opportunity for ASEAN to balance between the U.S. and China if the U.S. increase its involvement in terms of infrastructure development, because there's a rising concern about China's using its BRI projects to capture ASEAN stake. So in terms of project, I think you can see that there was Pompeo announced that there will be a down payment to further fund certain U.S. ASEAN cooperation on infrastructure. So I think going forward, it would be we will see more complementary in this area. Okay, I think you have okay, and just briefly about policy recommendation. I think that it's because the interaction between in terms of investment and infrastructure are one of the complementaries. I think that going forward, the U.S. and ASEAN governments should pursue cooperation in this area, investment in infrastructure. Okay, for investment, I think even though the Prime Minister hasn't followed up with the concrete programs yet, what they would like to bolster U.S. ASEAN investment, I think they could build on the existing framework that they have right now. The U.S. ASEAN cooperation in fostering infrastructure investment and also U.S. ASEAN cooperation in fostering transparency and good governance. I think there should be both sides should follow up with concrete programs. Yes. Okay. Regarding infrastructure, I think the U.S. is now developing IDFC. I haven't seen, and I hope that there will be some more concrete plans coming along to bolster U.S. ASEAN infrastructure cooperation. Right? And there are some areas that the U.S. can fill in customs clearance, e-commerce, and cybersecurity that ASEAN needs U.S. expertise to do so. So in terms of trade, I think because there's obvious clash between U.S. and ASEAN approach, but I think keeping communication warm is important to avoid misperception or misinterpretation of each other's policies. So I think that even though we cannot come up with the common ground yet for how to further trade between each other, I think communication is the key, and it would be great if that we can increase the frequency of key meetings between the U.S. trade representative and the ASEAN economic minister. Okay, and the use of track tool or the use of think tank to kind of foster dialogue or find ways to further foster trade is also important. So with that, in my presentation, thank you so much.
Great.
How is it? 12. Okay, I'm gonna.
My bits in the worksheets.
Oh, there we go. You all just saw the insides of my USB stick. Okay. All right. Great. I'm really grateful to get to talk about this issue here today. Basically, I realized as the rest of the panelists going through their presentations, I realized that the country that I'm covering is the only one that doesn't actually have a relationship with the United States. So, it does for now, but no one really knows what that relationship is yet. So I'm going to try to convince you of 4 things, or 4 points I want to make. One is that Donald Trump's policy of maximum pressure has had an impact on North Korea by getting China to implement sanctions on the country. The second is that it's pretty pointless to talk about a binary question of, are sanctions hurting the North Korean economy or are they not? It is the wrong question, and you cannot answer it with a yes or no answer. Third is that there is no economic disaster, at least there's no evidence of a major economic disaster in North Korea as a result of the sanctions. I would say that there is still an economic crisis. I have not looked up the dictionary definitions of these 2 terms, but I hope you'll see what I mean. So I'm going to start by a very minor snapshot from the border from China to North Korea from 2016. I believe this was in June. I visited Dandong. This is right outside the customs office in Dandong, which is the city that I believe around 70% of trade between China and North Korea go through the city. And this was actually a time when, for the gazillionth time, people were saying that, oh, China is finally implementing sanctions on North Korea, and this time they're really going to get it because there was a cap on North Korean coal imports. Basically, China and any UN member state is only allowed to import coal from North Korea under a levels under a certain cap. And yeah, when I talk to people driving these trucks from North Korea and to North Korea, and I ask them, so how are things? Have you seen any slowing of trade? Like, has anything special happened? And most of them are like, no, not really. Like I specifically asked about that spring. Like, has anything happened? Because I didn't want to phrase the questions in terms of to focus so explicitly on sanctions, but I was trying to get a sense of, are things slowing down? And not a single person I talked to said that they were. And that was very interesting to me, that in a time when news headlines around the world were saying that North Korea was being squeezed by China, quote unquote, talking to people who would supposedly experience that squeeze, I couldn't find any evidence of it. But then, and actually the numbers, later on when trade numbers came out for this time period, it turned out that in a time when no coal was supposed to be imported from North Korea, total coal imports had actually increased by China. And because there was a clause in these sanctions referring to exemptions for livelihoods in North Korea, to this day I haven't found a single person who's been able to tell me how one defines this, or how even North Korean authorities, or Chinese authorities for that matter, would be able to determine what proceeds from coal sales would go to livelihoods purposes and which would go directly to the manufacturing of missiles and nuclear weapons. But then something interesting happened. Around the spring of, well, as you can see, there's a graph showing North Korea-China trade numbers from January 2017 till March of 2018. It's the latest sort of raw numbers that I was able to get. But I think it speaks, it's a pretty clear language. Of course, anyone who's ever read anything about the North Korean economy using data will have read numerous variations of sort of caveats of, we don't really know, the data is hard to verify. We could do a whole 5-day convention on the problems with data from North Korea, and I'm happy to talk about it if anyone has specific questions or queries. But I'm going to skip over most of that for now because that's a whole other debate in its own right. So yes, this clearly, at the very least, we can say that there is a difference under the policy of maximum pressure, resulting in a drastic drop both in Chinese exports to North Korea and Chinese imports from North Korea. With the timing of these changes, there is just no other plausible way of explaining why this has happened. But at the same time, this is the interesting part where you have to do kind of a little bit of detective work. It doesn't seem that when looking at the raw data from North Korea, market prices, for example, that are reported by organizations in South Korea that have cell phone contact with people in North Korea, the prices really aren't behaving in the way that we would expect. And I suspect that the reason is both because we might be reading the data wrong, but also that when it comes to basic goods like rice and basic agricultural production, sanctions might not really be having any major impact. And to be fair to sanctions advocates, that's exactly the point. They shouldn't impact people's everyday lives, the everyday lives of civilians. But at the very least, the reason I use this data is not to say that, not really to say that nothing is happening in the North Korean economy as a result of sanctions or the like. I just want to point out that had there been a major economic disaster in North Korea right now, that people have been panicking on the markets, at the very least we should see some kind of impact in market prices. I can't say how big it would be, but it would be there somehow. And it just isn't. And I think when I was in the midst of writing the paper that this presentation is based on, these new numbers started coming out from North Korea that did indicate that something is happening with the foreign currency situation. This looks a lot more dramatic than it is. This is the Korean People's Won to US dollar exchange rate on markets inside North Korea. The thing is, currencies do fluctuate. It's kind of a natural feature of them. It's not that uncommon, and part of the graph is kind of spilling out over here, but as you can see, this seems to be an anomaly. For the most part, this exchange rate has been fairly normal as well. So again, whatever the impacts might be from sanctions, we really can't find clear signs of a major crisis in the economy as a result. But at the same time, foreign exchange rates have been more jumpy over the past few months, and I think that's something definitely worth keeping our eyes on. And actually, the most interesting price data point for me is gas prices, because these price trends vary so clearly with geopolitical tension. You know, almost like some of the most significant price drops, they align almost exactly with when Kim Jong-un has visited China. I find that very interesting. At the same time, so this graph shows gas prices from January of 2017, before the sort of worst tensions between North Korea and the US. It goes up to a peak in the sort of the late fall and winter of 2017, and then they go back to a more normal level. But it seems like with gas prices, there is sort of a new equilibrium under sanctions, where we can almost calculate the markup that sanctions are causing by looking at the so what seems to be the new normal price level under sanctions versus the old price level. And it seems to fluctuate mostly between sort of 12 and 15,000 won per kilogram. You measure gas prices or measure gas in kilogram in North Korea, versus sort of between a span of 8 to 10,000 before sanctions. So there's some sort of normalcy under more difficult conditions. At the same time, again, I want to return to this graph, because clearly something drastic has happened in North Korea's economic environment. I mean, not least, you have to export in order to be able to import. So we know from a pretty abundant availability of anecdotal evidence from North Korea that a number of factories have closed down, many of which manufacture goods that were exported to China. There's also the possibility that operations have ceased because they can't get spare parts that they need to import from China and other countries. And the foreign currency reserves of the regime, I mean, no matter how you look at it, they must be under severe pressure. Just even if we assume that, let's say that part of the difference between North Korea's imports from China and exports to China, let's say that part of that is financed by essentially loans from China or aid from China. I find it very hard to believe that they are supporting or subsidizing North Korea with the full amount. And especially with the magnitude of this drop in exports to China, foreign currency reserves of the regime must be under significant stress. And even if, so I don't know how many of you have read, I know one of you probably read the panel of experts report that came out a few weeks ago that said that sanctions were being invalidated. I can't remember the exact term, something like invalidated or being rendered ineffective by smuggling. The thing with smuggling is that when you're smuggling exports or exporting goods clandestinely, you are not going to be able to charge the same price as you would under normal conditions. And the goods that you buy from through smuggling, you're going to have to pay more money for. It's just a risk premium, a markup. So no matter how you look at it, North Korea is having problems because of sanctions. So I want to finish with this graph, and it's just to show that North Korea is a poor country, and I mean, most of you know that already. But I find that what sometimes gets lost in the discussions on to what extent sanctions matter is the fact that this is a regime and a society that has gone through massive difficulties and survived without really any major threats to social stability. And it's debatable to what extent things like gas prices actually matter, because the vast majority of the North Korean population don't drive cars, and many of them are completely disconnected from the market system where these rice prices and foreign currency prices are taken from. So North Korea, in a way, is comparatively durable because many people aren't really involved in the part of the economy that's being hit. So I'm gonna finish there and move over.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. And moving down to the southern half of the peninsula, the South Korean perspective.
Sorry.
Trump. Out of time already.
I had 30 seconds left. How dare you take them?
So an overview how Dr. Yoon structures his paper. He looks at the amendment to the Chorus of today, the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, and looks at the Section 201 tariffs on washing machines and solar panels before looking at the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. But before I get into that, I just want to say that Korea is sort of like a peculiar case in this instance because the bilateral trade deficit with Japan and China has sort of increased, and Korea, since Trump has taken over office, it's gone down significantly, and that Korea was one of the only two countries three countries that NAFTA to be targeted by Trump early on in the administration in terms of renegotiating trade agreements. So Korea has really hasn't necessarily fit the mold in terms of the bilateral trade deficit, but it's still been one of the first countries targeted by Trump as he sort of tries to reshape the trade relations in East Asia. So going over the trade statistics, Dr. Yoon starts off talking about how Korea has run a consistent trade surplus with the U.S. since the 1990s. In 2018, the U.S. was the second largest export destination for Korea, next to China, and then it was also the second largest import source for Korea. For the U.S., Korea is the seventh and the sixth most important exporting and importing country, respectively. So both the countries are pretty important to one another. And the leading export from Korea to the U.S. are semiconductors and autos. Autos, much like Japan. And Korea has been importing much more oil and gas from the U.S. in recent years. There's been a 520% increase in crude oil imports from the U.S. in 2017 to 2018, but the natural gas numbers are much higher. In 2016, Korea only imported $11 million worth of natural gas, and as of last year, it imported $2.25 billion, a growth rate of over 22,000%. So Korea has really been shifting more from traditional imports from the U.S. to this oil and gas as it tries to move away from coal and other sources of energy domestically. And we should, and Dr. Yoon notes that we should continue to expect that this oil and gas demand to continue to grow for the next few years. In terms of investment, South Korea has also been a major investor in the United States. They've invested $51 billion in the U.S. A lot of this is tied to the Chorus agreement. Since Chorus went into effect in 2012, the amount of Korean FDI in the United States effectively doubled. So that was about, it went into effect in 2012. So in the past 7 years, it's effectively doubled. And a large part of that in terms of, it's been tied to market forces, and but since Trump has come into office, there have been instances where President Moon of South Korea will come to the U.S. and he'll bring delegates. In 2017, he brought a number of delegates from Korean companies who pledged to invest over $17 billion in the U.S. $12 billion in the U.S. And a large part of this is largely due to market forces, but also as a way to show the Trump administration, that Korea is really trying to invest more to meet some of the concerns that Trump has espoused. And we should also expect Korean investment in the U.S. to increase as we look to the future. The Chorus amendments took place officially in January 2018. An agreement was reached in March 2018. There was obviously a lot of discussion beforehand. Trump called this a job killer, a horrible deal on the campaign trail, and that rhetoric transposed to his the first few months of his in office in 2017. And the first year or so, he was railing against South Korea and the Chorus FTA. There was a famous anecdote in Fire and Fury where he was threatening to withdraw from the Chorus FTA over Labor Day weekend, and that was sort of eventually thwarted by someone on his staff. But in the new agreement, there were actually only minor changes, despite the large rhetoric that the administration, the amount of rhetoric that Trump himself talked about with Chorus. There was a 25% tariff on trucks that was supposed to be phased out in 2025. This was extended to 2041, and even though Korean truck exports to the United States are almost non-existent, they increased the number of U.S. vehicles exported to Korea that would only need to meet U.S. safety standards, not meeting the higher Korean safety standards. And then there was this was all pushed by the U.S. Korea asked for some changes to ISDS in return, investor state dispute settlement mechanism, but that really was sort of not as much of an ask as the U.S. was asking. It was sort of Korea's a way to get on the table to sort of meet what the U.S. wanted, sort of tit for tat. So it's unclear why Trump made such a big deal about Chorus, but in the end only had minor changes to the deal. And then there's also been these protectionist movements, measures, the Section 201 tariff quota on washing machines and solar panels, and it's already taken a hit on these industries. Washing machines, Korean market share in the U.S. dropped from 16% in 2017 from 12.5%. And then solar panels, market share was down from 20.7 to 19.5 last year. And then on the Section 232 tariffs, Korea originally agreed to Korea was originally facing a 25% tariff on steel, and then that was replaced not by a steel tariff, but a quota that was limited to 70% of its steel exports. And then there was also under the same Section 232 tariffs, there was also a 10% tariff on Korean exports of aluminum, but Korean exports of aluminum, much like Korea's exports of trucks, are also fairly low, fairly limited, so they didn't really have that much of an impact. But where the 232 really can have a really big major impact is on Korean autos. Korea is the 5th largest auto exporter to the United States, and auto exports for Korea represent about 1.6% of GDP, so it's a big chunk of change that we're talking about. And one expert opinion showed that there was the U.S. if U.S. implemented the 25% tariff under 232, that there would be a drop of 22.7% in Korean auto exports to the United States. And then the paper ends with a regression table that shows that the U.S. trade balance with Korea has improved after Trump took office, and the statistics show this. And if you look at the overall goods and services trade deficit the U.S. has with Korea in 2016, it was about $16.5 billion. The latest trade numbers out just yesterday, this week, show that it's only now about $5.3 billion. So the numbers have been going down. This has been going down since before Trump took office. And then the only thing that I would push back on Dr. Yoon on is that he says that that this deficit is actually due to Trump's trade policies and pressure, but it's much more likely driven by market forces such as the massive growth in oil and gas. And that's how he concludes his paper. So I'll now put on my discussant hat, and talk a little bit about, I want to sort of present some overarching questions, because Gil and I had an opportunity to look at the papers beforehand and make some comments. So in the interest of getting enough time for the audience Q&A, I'll just sort of maybe try and connect the papers in the way I kind of see them being connected, even though from the sanctions perspective, there's this concern about the overuse of sanctions could draw people away from the dollar into other sources of mediums of exchange, source of value, blockchains or other currencies. And then there's also a concern in terms of the pressure that U.S. places on China right now could push them to further internationalize the RMB as a way to sort of decrease dollar dependence, and as you said, Peter, to try and figure out how to strategic decouple. And it's this, in a sense, that there is this push from the U.S., but there's also this pull factor, and sort of how do you mold, how do you sort of make sense of the two? and I was just wondering if anyone had any comments on the role of the dollar in financial interdependence.
I mean, can I just clarify with the use of dollars in North Korea is fairly low. It's which is why I use the dollar to make a point. But just to be clear, it's not a currency that most North Koreans hold. That's all I wanted to.
But for the North Koreans, that is when we talk about the dollarization of the North Korean economy has been fairly, as the won sort of depreciates in value. The dollar has this important role to play in North Korea, unless it is more focused on the RMB.
I would say it's more focused on the RMB. The people or entities in North Korea that hold dollars are most likely state enterprises. And if the regime would want to keep the dollar stable, then they could just order those state enterprises not to use the dollars as a means of exchange amongst themselves. I have met very few North Koreans who say that they used US dollars in the country. It would also not make sense because most people they trade with are Chinese. So for the vast majority of the population, the RMB is what really matters. But I mean, the dollar is not unimportant, and every point of data that we get should be studied carefully. But at the same time, and I mean, for the RMB as well, the exchange rate has been slightly higher than in normal times over the past few weeks. I haven't seen the latest data published, but still, the overall trend is pretty much the same.
On the financial markets, in terms of capital markets, the United States remains supreme. I mean, this is where. This is Canada. The United States, the United States is the calls shots. We see that very clearly with how the Federal Reserve policy really impacts global markets, and so that is a continuum. The challenge really comes into investment patterns, right? Especially in the manufacturing sector, which really needs to have a long-term strategic vision. And although we're not seeing flight of capital from the United States into other countries just yet, there is a hold from countries like Japan, which does have excess capital, and it is looking for sources for direct investment. And yes, we can talk about Toyota investing more in the United States, etc. But when you look at the broader trend, it's not going up in the United States. It's actually on a hold pattern because of these uncertainties. And that is a direct impact from the Trump administration. But what I do want to add there is that whether or not Trump is a one-term or two-term president, there is an acknowledgement, certainly in Japan, that there has been a shift in U.S. thinking, and that there is going to be a different relationship that countries will have with the United States, whether on the economic front or the security front. And now it's a question of preparing for those changes and how they can be proactive in meeting those changes.
So I'll offer just a minute or two of remarks. And I actually want to pick up, Ben, with something you said about North Korea and the dollar. And it is interesting, right? I agree with you. My assessment is you've probably looked at the within North Korea use of the dollar more closely than I have. My assessment is also you don't actually see a lot of dollar use within North Korea. That said, you do see quite a bit of attempted dollar use by North Korea in its external trade, right? And so a number of the major U.S. sanctions actions against, like, Bank Kunlun, which was a Chinese bank that was sanctioned by the U.S. for facilitating North Korean external trade. According to the Treasury Department, there were hundreds of millions of dollar-denominated financial transactions it was engaging in. Similarly, some of the Chinese trading companies that the U.S. sanctioned within the last year, Kunlun was a 2017 action, I believe, were also dollar-denominated trade. And I think that gets back to the point you put on the table, which is the dollar on the sort of international trading system, the external trading system of all countries. The dollar retains this very strong dominance. It's kind of interesting. There's been talk about the decline of the dollar for many years. I mean, from the 1990s and early 2000s, it was about the euro. Now, obviously, over the last couple of decade or so, we've seen, efforts by the Chinese to internationalize the RMB and create some challenger currency. And of course, we also have the Bitcoin and the, cryptocurrency issue. If you look at the numbers, what you've actually seen happen to the dollar, so you probably saw, a gradual and slight diminishment of the role of the dollar in various metrics between 2000 and 2008. And then there's this sort of seemingly bizarre phenomenon during the global financial crisis where there was a flight to perceived safety. And so you actually saw this significant, measurable, significant increase in the role of the dollar sort of 09 and 10 coming out of the financial crisis, even though the U.S. was the source of it in many ways. When you looked at the follow-on Eurozone crisis and just the overall concern about the global economy, you had this huge flood into U.S. T-bills, into dollars, and so further dollarization. So you actually have seen this kind of strengthening of the role of the dollar over the last 5 or 8 years, which I think has been one factor that has kind of reinforced the efficacy and potency of U.S. sanctions. Now, so then you get into this question of, are we finally maybe at a tipping point with the U.S. dollar, where aggressive use of U.S. sanctions combined with Trump administration global mismanagement and alienating allies, combined with aggressive efforts by the European Union, which has set up a sort of Iran sanctions circumvention tool, and China internationalizing the RMB. Are we at some kind of tipping point? I don't know. It's something I think about quite a bit. I doubt it in the sense of I think it's low probability, but it's not zero. If you look historically, there have been multi-currency worlds. Barry Eichengreen has argued that very persuasively. So you could see a multi-currency world emerge. Whether we're at that tipping point, I don't know. My final point on this, though, is actually my colleague Liz Rosenberg and I have a paper coming out next month on this topic. I think what the world will find is even if there's a multi-currency world, the U.S. is going to retain, from a sanctions perspective, an enormous amount of leverage through other choke points we control. So to give an example, ZTE, U.S. had over a barrel last year, not because of any there's no financial measures at all. It was we controlled key technological inputs. And so while even if there's a multi-currency world, you'd probably see some diminution in the efficacy of sanctions. And I think there'd be a whole host of economic problems for the U.S. as a result. From a narrow perspective of sanctions efficacy, what I think you'd see is greater reliance on other U.S.-controlled global economic choke points.
Just add a few comments here. Talk about the role of USD in the region, and then talking about the yuan, right? The Chinese attempt to internationalize yuan, and what's the yuan increasing role in the region as well. So if, looking at the ASEAN Southeast Asian region, USD is still dominant in the region trade. Some key commodities such as oil is quoted in the USD. And also we have, I think probably many of you know that in East Asian region, we have what we call Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, CMIM in short, which is a regional safety net. It's kind of like an idea of the pool of funds to provide liquidity to crisis economy, right? So the CMIM was born out of the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. If you observe the currency swap has been done under this framework, most of them are in USD, so the USD is swapped with the local currency. There are a few swaps that are using yuan to swap with other currency, but the USD is still dominant in that area. And talking about the yuan internationalization, is a deliberate attempt by the Chinese government to promote its currency. I think you can see that yuan is now included in the IMF SDR, special drawing right, and that's also increased the yuan holding within the central bank vaults in Southeast Asia. I don't have a number, but that many Southeast Asian governments respond by increasing its yuan holding within the central bank vault. But I don't think yuan will topple the USD as a dominant currency in coming years, because firstly, even though yuan more goods now are being transacted in yuan, but if you look at the China yuan denominated asset in the region, it's not as high, and partly is because Chinese government is still imposing capital control, and that also undermine the willingness of Southeast Asian investor to hold on to the yuan asset, right? So I don't think the yuan will take over USD as a dominant currency in the region.
Thank you. I'm cognizant we only have 20 minutes left, so I'm going to save my question and turn things over to the audience. We can take a couple. We'll start 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you very much. Question for Yuan, and thank you for your presentation. It's great, and I agree with everything you said, but I just out of curiosity, I have a couple of questions. One is about going back to this thing about the dollar-won exchange rate. And I think, because the scale you used, it perhaps exaggerated a little bit the fluctuations, and you did refer to that, but since 2013, actually, it's incredibly stable. It's a bit of a mystery, really. And I don't know how to explain this. I just wonder what your take was, because, some people have argued that there's effectively a currency peg taking place there, and that will require foreign exchange reserves, which, as you said, there's a bit of a crisis there. So I just wondered what your take was on that. And my other question was, it's more about the secondary impact of sanctions, really, and about the government responses that have been adopted to deal with sanctions. So Kim Jong-un, since 2015, has talked about import substitution. And I suspect also that the market-friendly policy is also a way of dealing with sanctions in a way, trying to tap into the dynamism of the market, trying to absorb proceeds from private economic activity. And there's been legal changes to underpin this as well. So, you could actually argue that the sanctions have been a spur towards government policy that's actually strengthened and made the economy more resilient in certain ways. There's almost a positive, notwithstanding that certain regions and sectors of population have been negatively impacted. So I just wonder what your take was.
I'm interested in Goto's view on the potential decoupling of technology partnership between US and Japan, because the US pressure on Chinese technology would be detrimental to Japan's supply chain with the other Asian partners, especially with China. So how do you see this would affect Japan? Because you mentioned hedging twice. So
Right.
I wonder if that would Japan would try to prevent US-China decoupling on security and economic affairs. And secondly, to Karen, so you mentioned that the balance between US and China on the infrastructure gap, but I think US commitment on that is still not announced yet, even though there is a lot of State Department visit to the region frequently for the past few months and assure us that would be such a promise. But don't you think that Japan is a more reliable partner in terms of infrastructure development aid? And of course, also Korea started to venture into this area as well. We see many infrastructure projects being constructed by Korea in Brunei and Malaysia. So then I will have a coffee with you tomorrow too.
Oh, really? Yes.
So, I have a question about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So, because I'm doing research about developing countries, FDI's impact in developing countries, FDI in developing countries, in terms of the government. So you were talking about actually the U.S. strategies in that region. One of your strategies is kind of promoting the governance
yeah, sure. Thank you for these are really interesting questions, and they are very fun to debate and to analyze. They're also very difficult. So I'm gonna give my best assessments with the caveat that this is not something that we can actually know. On the USD and RMB stability, I, together with a friend and colleague, we wanted to find quantitative evidence for the Korean People's Won being pegged to the RMB, because that makes sense. What we found when we compared stability of the exchange rate between US dollars and renminbi is that the dollar was actually more stable than the RMB rate over time. And this is not supposed to be the case. If the won is pegged to the RMB, then that should be the more stable currency. What I suspect is going on is that because the RMB is much more widely used than the dollar, that it is more of a real market in a way, that it actually fluctuates for different reasons than the dollar. I think we often, because we have data on North Korea, I suspect that those of us who work on the North Korean economy sometimes assume that the economy is more developed than it actually is, that it functions more in the way of an economy that we're used to, that we can conceptualize and use economic theory to study. But the exchange rate for dollars, I don't think we should look at as a regular market that would react to things like anxiety and whatnot, because just like Peter pointed out here, there are a lot of, like, the dollar is not irrelevant to North Korea by any means, but the entities that hold US dollars, they tend to be part of what some would argue is part of the state economy, while the renminbi might be, or is probably much more widely used in the market economy. I don't think they are as easy to separate as some would argue, because the people working in one are still in one way or the other linked to the other. So, but yeah, it would be great to, we could certainly spend hours talking about that. With these secondary impacts, I agree very much that that was one point that I'd written it down on my piece of paper, but I didn't mention it during the presentation, that the North Korean regime doesn't really have, when it comes to economic policy, I have a hard time seeing what options they have right now for getting out of the problem that they're in of very, very low trade. And part of what it does seem like they've been trying to do is, yes, tap into the private economy, of allowing more private investments into state projects and things like that. What's interesting, though, with the legal changes is that according to the most complete list that I've been able to gather of legal changes, a lot of it seems to happen starting in 2012. And for some reason, things are not happening really after 2016. And I'm not sure why, but it's just a flurry of activity. And then by 2016, sometime around that time, we just don't, it's hard to find other sort of institutional changes or legal changes. A lot of what we call legal changes are actually decrees, which is part of, it's very problematic, but it's partially a separate debate. Did I miss anything? No,
On the spillover effect of the U.S. hardline stance against China on technology, take it above that and talk about more broadly U.S.-China trade friction and the spillover effect on the region and how it impacts the supply chain. It's undeniable, and that has been of primary concern to businesses. And within that, yes, a withdrawal or a cutback on technological exchange or restrictions between the United States and China would certainly impact companies as well. But this is actually when we look at the bigger picture of relations between the United States and China and how it impacts the region, it's a smaller issue, right? Because the stakes are so much higher. When I talked about the United States fighting a trade war on two fronts, on the deficit and on essentially structural reform in China, if there is an approach by the United States simply to deal with the deficit, then there is a new approach for other countries to deal with the United States and its anxieties and its concerns. But if it comes down to the structural reform issues, then it opens up a new way to engage with the United States. going to this issue of technological decoupling, if we look for relations between Japan and the United States, we see that Japan very much wants to enhance cooperation with the United States. So as Huawei continues to be an issue that isn't simply about the telecommunications group, but really about the fight over technology regulation and concerns about data espionage, Japan was one of the first countries to side with the United States. And that is not to say there is a great deal of concern within Japan that's being expressed in Germany or in the UK, but it has been seen as a strategic move to align itself with Washington in the bigger interests. And so what are the bigger interests? When we talk about trade agreements, yes, we can talk about the minutiae of buy more oil, import more oil, have perhaps even a new type of voluntary export restriction on critical industries. But that should not be the focus. The focus should be about opportunities that the Japanese are doing, for instance, with car companies, right? In Silicon Valley, cars are no longer just a unit to move. They are the source of innovation in data management and in robotics and self-driving, etc. Anything that would restrict that is seen as something that would be detrimental to not just U.S.-Japan relations broadly, but really for Japan's economic future as well, as we move more towards a service-focused trade relation.
Okay, thank you. Just going back to your question about why ASEAN would like to engage U.S. and use it to balance against China, right? Why not? And also, why not interested more in Japan and South Korea will also offer infrastructure aids and infrastructure development. Sorry I didn't make myself clear earlier, but the balancing between the U.S. and China in the region is more than economic matter. It's because it's about the strategic issue, a strategic matter as well, because because the U.S., as you know, in terms of military prowess, the U.S. is number one in the world, right? So the idea of the idea of the region state that is having is that if we pull in the U.S., engage the U.S. in also economically, that would help. They would help bring the U.S. back to a region, and militarily it would also help ASEAN balance between the U.S. and China in the security front too. So does it make sense for you? So it's more like bringing the U.S. in. Of course, the U.S. commitment right now is just as far as we can see. We just see the Pompeo announced the down payment of $113 million USD, right? And I think the U.S. If they want to go forward with infrastructure development in the region, they would have to tap onto the savings of the private sector, which I don't know how much to what extent the U.S. government will be able to do so, because the U.S. American business model is not like in China that the government can tell firms or businesses what to do, right? So I'm not sure how much private sector would contribute to the infrastructure development in the region. Yeah. So it's balancing is more beyond economic act. Yeah, Japan and South Korea, I acknowledge that they were very important, and Japan, just rolled out it has been involved in the region through ODA and also through its Asian Development Bank project, and it also unveiled its new strategy in the region. I think last year they unveiled the new Mekong strategy, right? Looking at to further develop the Mekong, the mainland Southeast Asia sub-region. Yeah, ASEAN also recognized Japan as one of the key development partners in the region. South Korea is very interesting. South Korea, we see it as also a development partner, but we see that North Korea is a latecomer than Japan, and then behind Japan and China, but it has been progressing well in specific niche areas. For example, if you look at the hydropower development in the region, South Korea company has been winning the medium-sized hydropower project. It seems like they are targeting the medium-sized hydropower, not the big one, not the smaller one. So, and also South Korea's role has been great in terms of developing information and communication technology, especially in Indonesia, right? In Brunei also. Yes, yeah. And I think back to your question about, okay, how do we know whether the U.S. FDI or U.S. investment in the region are really promoting good governance? That Trump administration is saying that. Yeah, okay. Actually, I don't have an answer to that because as far as I gather from my research is that the investment area is the area that the Trump administration has not been followed up with concrete action. But if you can look at the direction of how the Trump administration would gauge whether the investment is promoting good governance or not, maybe you just go back to my slides. So the Trump administration say that it plans to develop to better in the investment climate, to facilitate private sector investment, and also the investment encouraging innovation and entrepreneurship. So I think if the investment, the U.S. is following along this line, we perhaps could say that it's promoting good governance that the Trump administration wants. But I'm not sure about, because I haven't seen the criteria. They haven't cranked out a specific criteria how to measure it yet. But I think if this fall along this line, it should be promoting good governance. Thank you.
So we have time for one last round of questions. We have one up front.
Yeah, I want to go back to this idea of the countries in the region are trying to hedge or balance as a result of all these changes taking place. And then what came out seemed to me is that, well, the countries are now trying to sort of work with China economically, but they want the U.S. back in terms of providing security. But I think in the past several decades, increasingly, all the economic changes taking place meant that the separation of economic relationship and security relationship really is not possible. And the kind of bilateral approach of the current administration dealing with the different countries, when China seems to be the key strategic competitor, to me at least doesn't really, make sense in terms of advancing American interests. So I'm just wondering two things. One is what's sort of the Washington perspective on how you really manage that if you have all these major technological competition with China, you have all these various other things, you want your allies to come on board. At the same time, you have all these sort of difficulties with individual countries that make them feel that they need the hedge and the balance. So somehow I just cannot square this. So maybe you can provide some clues to the approach. The other one is really, are these countries in the region really realistically thinking that they can have good relationship with China only economically, and then they can pursue other policy objectives in terms of security relationship, and whether there would be more broadly there would be fragmentation or different sort of countries moving in different directions, making the whole sort of system, the regional order really breaking down.
One last question from Gil.
Peter, you have discussed the Trump impact in terms of much of it similar to what would have been the Obama impact. So it seems to me one has to ask, what is different 2 years from now, from the beginning of the Trump administration, than what there was then? And second, how was the Trump impact different from the expected impact, given the bipartisan consensus on things like export controls and the threat of the Chinese economy and the business business community changing. Can you make any effort to sort of separate out the two and say, roughly, this is what the Obama impact would have been, or the post-Obama impact would have been, had someone else been president?
All right, let me offer a couple of comments, actually addressing both the questions. I think there's some relationships there. So Gil, first on your question, in terms of what I see as different, and this is in some sense, guesstimates, right? We don't know; it's an alternate reality. I don't think that. A Hillary Clinton or another Democratic president, depending on the outcome of the 2020 elections, will be as strongly focused on tariffs. I think you would see a fairly similar emphasis on these non-tariff tools, export control reform on technology, Chinese investment in the U.S., targeted measures. I think you'd see continuity there. I think tariffs would have been seen as a bit too much of a blunt instrument with too many collateral, unintended, or maybe intended but not good impacts. So I think that's sort of a big, in terms of the tool outlay, I think that's a big difference you would have seen. I also think you would have seen a big difference on the diplomatic approach with allies. Now, I think with allies, first of all, I should say within the Trump administration, there are clearly divisions of opinion on how to treat allies, right? I think you have seen Lighthizer try with a very limited amount of success over the last maybe 6 or 9 months to try to get Japan and the European Union on board with a multilateral approach to China. I think the administration has been its own worst enemy in achieving that because all the steel and aluminum tariffs and auto tariffs, obviously allies don't want to cooperate with the U.S. on China when they themselves are being whacked by tariffs. So I think you would have seen a very different, you just wouldn't have seen these actions against allies, which I think, actually leads to my final point, which is sort of, I think President Trump has a fundamentally different view on this relationship between security and economic allies than most other American politicians do. For most American politicians, the view is essentially, we use our trade and economic policy to deepen trade and economic relations with our security allies. So, post-Cold War, we're building a European order. We want NATO. We want deep and trading relations there. We want to build this. Trump, I think, has a fundamentally different view. He has, and maybe it's because he's a landlord, who extracted rents his whole life, but he views, his view on trading relations is how do I extract rents from my security allies? It's just a fundamentally different view of how these two relate to each other. And that's why I think from his perspective, of course you're going to impose tariffs on your allies because you have all these defense expenditures and, you can kind of shake them down. They're under threat from China. They're under threat from Russia. Well, he doesn't see Russia as a threat, but, they're under threat. Like, we can shake them down and, extract some rents from them. And it's just a fundamentally different view of the relationship.
Does anyone else have any last comments before we end?
Yeah, I just, that's such an interesting psychoanalysis of U.S. president. I'm going to use it. But it's not binary, right? It's not turning away from the United States and going to China. Hedging means perhaps being dependent less on one and depending a little bit more on the other. So the equation becomes a little bit different. The composition changes. So I think this is what we're trying to do on the economic front too. So that in the case of Japan, there had been this very, very frosty relationship between Japan and China over the last few years, primarily over territorial disputes in the East China Sea. They've decided to shelve that at the moment and really try to move forward first on economic relations and then to agree to continue to disagree. Now, is this a tenable situation? Probably not. But at the same time, this is good for business. This is good for regional stability, which should also lead to security, we hope. The other change that I'm seeing, this is outside of my own focus, but the United States had the hub and spoke system for security. There is a network of alliances that is developing, and that the United States, even though it would continue to be a big player, it is not central and at the focal point of the alliance. And I think when we look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, one of the good things about it is that it is one of the few examples of the United States willing to embrace a multilateral approach. And anything that would bring the United States into the fold of a more multilateral approach to trade or to security is something that should be welcomed by the region.
Thank you all. This is a really stimulating conversation, and I look forward to the final papers as we get them ready for the release in July. And I want to commend you for your great presentations here today. I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking them for their comments.